Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Join George. I'm George, and I'm joined today by Anna Needham from Decibel Podcasts. So we hold these webinars, live chats monthly with the aim of sharing knowledge from industry experts. So it's a very informal setup. Please do ask questions on the chat and we can pause to answer them throughout. So it's more of a conversation. We don't want to just talk at you. We want to engage who we have on the call. So before I do introduce Juliana, I'd like to know who's joined today. So if you could type in your name in the chat function and let me know where you're dialing in from. And I can have a look up at my monitor and see who we've got with us today. I do know Sophie's joined and I believe John has joined because I think it's his birthday today. Jason, sorry, not John, I apologise. Jason, happy birthday, Jason. Thanks for joining us. He let me know that on LinkedIn that he was going to join. It was his birthday. So there's Jason, thank you. Hi, George. Sophie from Bristol. Fantastic. Anyone else want to let us know you're out there? It's good to know who you are. Katie, hi, George from Warwick. Lovely. Hi, Juliana. Hey, Danny from Leamington. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. And then before I do introduce Juliana, actually, we're going to talk about podcasts today. So my question is, do you have a favourite podcast or one that you would recommend? That's a great question, I think, to start us off. And we can share some of those out. So any favourite podcasts or podcasts you would recommend? I have an example, actually, which I'll share straight off while everyone else is thinking. I really enjoy Mother Pucker. So I started to follow her on socials. Probably around the time I was having my children, I was trying to balance work and motherhood. And then she's gone on from strength to strength. And then, of course, she's started a podcast. So I was already interested in her in her content, if you like, before I then listened to her podcast. So I think it's worth sort of noting that that's how she drew me in. Let's have a look at our examples. So, Diary of a CEO, fantastic, classic, but very popular. Dirty Mother Pucker, Sophie's got on there again, the same as myself. And then Sophie, I believe this is your own podcast. So, Clickable by HDE Agency. So, yeah, we want to hear more about that as our session goes on today. So, thanks, guys. a few more coming in. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Juliana now. So, hello, Juliana.
Hello.
Thanks for coming into the studio today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, I'm going to just start off by asking first question, really. Just a bit of history, about kind of your career, where you started and how you got into the world of podcasting.
Okay, I'm going to just rewind a bit and say that the one podcast that I listened to over the summer, which I loved, is The Missing Madonna. And that is about a painting that was stolen from a castle in Scotland. And it's narrated by the woman whose dad helped return the painting, but it takes a few interesting twists and turns. It's really well made. It's a BBC one. It was out last year, but I really enjoyed it. It's short, it's about 8 episodes. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
So podcasting for me, it was the kind of natural progression. So I worked for the BBC for a long time. I worked in radio. I worked for Radio 4, some quite highbrow news programmes where I was a broadcast assistant and then researcher. I worked for Newsbeat on Radio 1, which was the most fun you could probably have in a job. And then I worked as a reporter for local TV and radio in this region, which is why I moved up here.
To the Midlands, yeah.
To the Midlands. So had a really good background in radio, which I loved doing, a bit of TV, worked for Sky News for a bit as a freelance reporter, and then worked as a business journalist. And when I was doing that job, I launched a podcast for the company, which at that time was owned by the same parent group that owned Penguin. So we had access to Penguin's audiobook studio. So it was really easy to start a podcast. I started that podcast 11 years ago with my colleagues. And so I was doing that for a while. And then fast forward a couple of years, I thought, wow, now is the moment for podcasting. So I decided a few things changed in my life. And I just thought, it's time. I'd been thinking about being self-employed for ages and just thought, now is the moment to podcast. That was 6 years ago. So I resigned from my job to start doing podcasts. I would say it was a little bit early because I had a background in business journalism, and so I was very much targeting businesses, and a lot of them weren't kind of quite there 6 years ago.
No.
But move forward a few years and they absolutely are. I get asked to do quite a lot of work. I work through a company called Fresh Air. I do some work. I work with one main client through them, and that's Barclays. And I've worked on that podcast for 4 years. It's for mortgage brokers. I absolutely love doing it. I'll talk a bit more about it later on. I also present a podcast about mergers and acquisitions, which is what I used to write about as a journalist.
Right, okay.
And that's for my old company. They asked me back to present the podcast that I launched 11 years ago. So I've been doing that for a few years now. Podcasts are the kind of natural intersection of my journalism and radio experience.
Yes, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, so just picking out some of those points there, Juliana. So you started podcasting about 6 years ago, and you say you were a little bit early. I mean, that's always going to, surely I think that's going to play in your favour to get in there before everyone else, of course. And like you say, businesses weren't doing podcasts then. For me, as a podcast listener, the things I'm drawn to are, of course, sort of more outside of work. More recreational things that I'm interested in. And I think what I'd really like to get to today and share with everybody on the webinar is about how they can really help your business.
Yeah.
Because, I think I want to know that. We don't run a podcast at Purple Monster, but, what could I be listening to enhance our business? So, I kind of, just really want to get into the nitty gritty of how they can really help grow businesses. That sort of thing, as opposed to, like I say, for me, who just listens to nice ones that as I'm driving to work.
And I think there's a really useful distinction between a business podcast that a business makes versus a fun podcast in inverted commas, because if the Diary of the CEO is up there as one that somebody enjoys, which has got a business element to it because they're interviewing leaders, and Stephen Bartlett's obviously had a very successful business or several businesses. If you're listening to it in a personal capacity, like a sports podcast, you will give it a lot more of your time. If it's very specifically work focused, it will probably be a bit shorter, or I would recommend it being a bit shorter. Yeah. But I think the way they can work for businesses is or the way they maybe can't work for businesses, what a lot of people started doing, and you've probably seen a few on LinkedIn, is that they become a very thinly veiled sales pitch. And it's one person working for the business talking to the other person about how great their business is. There's not much an audience member can take away from that. So I'd say it should never be a sales pitch for a business. It's much more subtle marketing. And somebody listening to it should be able to take something away from that. So the Barclays podcast that I mentioned, that's quite a good example that our target audience is mortgage brokers. So we know exactly what the demographic is of that person, what their job is, how they work. We know a lot of them are self-employed or work for a very small business, but we know their pain points. Yes. And so we can create content which is useful for them. And so thinking about your business, it's not necessarily your customers that you want to target with a podcast. It can be kind of more broader thought leadership.
Yes, yeah.
So it can be about building connections within your industry. It can be, just kind of hitting a slightly different audience than your target customer. But they can work in different ways for different businesses. I was just going to give a quick example, which is so the company I work with has made a podcast for Auto Trader, and they've done this in a car. And they've got celebrities to drive around. It's a bit like carpool karaoke. They've got people to drive around and they film them. Then they interview them about why this car is relevant to them and why the place is relevant to them.
Fantastic. And I love that idea. So we can come back onto that, because that's then about making yours stand out, isn't it? Giving it an edge. But just in terms of that content, like I say, when you think about a business podcast, you make a really good point, Juliana, that your attention span's perhaps not going to be as long. So you want them to be a little bit shorter. You want to know who your target market is, who your audience is. And then for me, as I listen to you, I'm realising that actually it really is just a progression of your newsletter or any sort of written content that you would put out there. Again, like you say, not salesy necessarily, but a blog post that relates to your work. That could then be
useful content.
A discussion podcast, couldn't it?
Yeah, so I'll give you the example of a law firm. I made a few different podcasts for DLA Piper, which is obviously a massive law firm, but for a smaller niche law firm, it's a really easy win on the thought leadership because your potential clients can listen to that and understand who you are, how you operate. You can really easily connect your podcast to a blog post, a newsletter, for businesses creating other content for LinkedIn, like a carousel post with kind of key takeaways. And there are some amazing podcast-specific AI tools available that can turn your audio recording into a blog post or a LinkedIn post with the click of a button, which is brilliant. So it can link into all your other content creation, all your other thought leadership creation, and it's getting easier all the time.
Fantastic. Okay. So just going to pause, see if anyone's got any questions before we move on. Anyone got any questions around podcasts for business, basically? And for Juliana, before I move on to start to ask her how we get going, how you make a start. Doesn't look like it, but please type in whenever you're ready. So let's say I'm on the call now. I'm looking, okay, I could turn some of my newsletters or my blog posts into podcasts. I can see this working. Now what? What do I do? What's the next step?
I think what you've just said is the key, because a lot of people love the idea of podcasting, don't know where to get going, and they're like, I've got to create loads of new ideas, loads of new content. Go back to your old content, look at your blog posts, look at your newsletters if you've been making them, and just think how that's the point of discussion. So, and I worked with a woman last year, and she had tons and tons of blog posts, and we just said, do 5-minute episodes, just you, and turn those 5 key points. That's the podcast, like 5 key points or 3 key points from your blog post. So that's a really easy way to get started. In terms of the logistics of it,
the tech side
of it. So it depends if it's going to be one, but you can do short solo podcasts, which is what this woman did. Yeah. If you're doing longer episodes, I'd generally recommend you do it with somebody else. So that might be a guest, it might be a co-host. You can either record in person, or you can record remotely. So the remote recording platform that I use is Riverside. It works really similarly to Zoom, but it records quality audio. So the sound of it is much, much better. And it also records video. And it's got some really good AI tools that can turn a video into different clips, that it just generates itself, that then you can post on social media. So you don't need to use the whole thing.
Like little teasers.
We can maybe talk a bit about video podcasts later, but I would generally recommend kind of including video in some form. So if you're doing remote recording, Riverside is the easiest win. There are other platforms that are similar, but Riverside...
And you simply download that and
you don't even need to download it. You use it through your browser, you send someone a link, they join, and then you can download the audio and you get a combined audio track, or you've got the separate audio tracks, and the same with the video.
And Juliana, what about, microphones? I mean, literally, is it okay just to use the microphone that I've got on my laptop?
So hit and miss. So if you've got a brilliant, up-to-date laptop, and it's a Mac, the microphone is probably going to be good enough. I would nearly always recommend people buy a USB microphone, because getting the positioning really helps. And when you hear the difference between someone recording directly through the laptop microphone versus their microphone, it's the world of difference. There is a big caveat to this, and it's something which a lot of people when they're starting out struggle with, is that they don't use their microphone properly. And so they have the microphone, and sometimes it's facing the wrong way.
Oh, right.
So a lot of microphones have either a silver dot or a light on them, and so you need to make sure it's facing the right way. And they all work slightly differently, and they all have a kind of optimum distance from your mouth. It's normally about that far away.
Okay.
But some of them are slightly further, some of them are slightly closer. Some of them have a dial on the microphone. Some of them you need to adjust
Some people don't like
settings.
this. We've got this sort of sound, haven't we?
Yeah, so that's kind of distorting
Or
it.
of course,
too close.
too far away.
Too far away and it sounds distant.
Like you're straining to hear.
Yeah, exactly. So using a microphone should eliminate some of those problems, but not always, and people don't always use them right. But I'd definitely recommend a USB microphone you can plug in directly into your laptop. And if anyone wants any recommendations for microphones, I've got a whole list, and that keeps evolving because newer ones come on the market some of them can eliminate echo, so they're brilliant. So yeah, you can record remotely using Riverside. You can use Zoom. I would recommend Riverside over Zoom.
Yeah.
And then you can look at recording in person. So recording in a studio, there are increasing numbers of podcast studios that are around in this area. There is one Mill Street, there's the Folge that's putting in their studio. There is one in Coventry, there are a few in Birmingham. There are a range of different studios. I'd generally recommend if you're using a manned studio or woman's, because you're going to get much better sound. There are some self-operated studios. Pirate is the main one. They've got studios everywhere, but they're a bit rough and ready. Or you can buy the equipment and record in an office. But if you do that, you want it acoustically treated. So you want some kind of paneling, you want it to be soundproofed. Echo is one of the biggest problems with audio recording, and it really sounds terrible. So, but yeah, happy to suggest a setup and a recorder and everything else if anyone is interested in that.
We have got a couple of questions actually, so I'm going to pause there. Simple question, but a great one. How long should a podcast be? Katie wants to know.
Excellent question. So I would say when you're starting out, I would keep it shorter. So in terms of production, you could either say I'm going to keep it short and tightly produced, so it's edited, it sounds really slick, or you could say it's longer and unedited. And I worked with a woman a few years ago who just said, I don't want you to edit my podcast, they're unedited conversations. I just want you to stick the beginning and the introduction and the outro in and the music on. And she made a virtue of the fact they were unedited conversations. And there is something about that. I would say when you're starting out, if you record, say 2 hours of audio and you want to edit that down to half an hour, that is way too much work.
That is a lot.
And it would cost you a fortune if you got an external editor to do that. So I would say for a business podcast, so I work with Fresh Air, which is the leading branded podcast producer in the country, if not Europe. And the sweet spot is about 20 minutes. For a branded business podcast, 20 minutes is a really good starting point. You could do it slightly shorter than that, but kind of between 15 and 25, I would say.
We say similar actually when we're running events here and we've got speakers, delivering business content. Absolutely, 20 minutes before you've lost people. So 20 minutes seems to be the magic number. So there you go, Katie, 20 minutes. Rian's asked a question, which moves us into a different space actually, but it's a great question. How do you track the success of your podcast? So as a relatively new channel, what does success look like?
Well,
Two questions.
This is a bit like, how long's a piece of string?
Yeah.
So with some of the podcasts that I make, it's not about audience numbers. It's not about how many people are listening. It's about the level of the engagement and are the right people listening. So with the podcast hosting platform, so you always want to get your podcast on a podcast-specific hosting platform. So that would be Acast, Buzzsprout, Omni is another one that I use, Transistor, and they have got really good analytics. You then link them into the distribution platforms, or the apps, so Apple, Spotify, iHeart Podcasts. But what you get your analytics on the back end of your hosting platform, you also get your analytics on Apple or Spotify, so you can go and see how many people are listening through those. They should all be added up and put on the hosting platform.
Okay.
It's not a very fine art, so you can see what the numbers are like. I would say don't get too hung up on the numbers. If your goal is a big audience, then you want to see those numbers going up. Yeah. But if you've got an engaged audience, the numbers aren't going down, then that's a good shout. So you can see how many people subscribe. So you want lots of subscribers because then the podcast just arrives in their Apple Podcast app or Spotify. And some of the hosting platforms, you can see how long people are listening for. So if you've got a half-hour podcast and people are stopping listening at 20 minutes in, you know that you need to cut the thing. But I work with some clients that just want to promote certain businesses, and of course they want people listening, but it's not always about having a big audience. And also bear in mind that some people with a podcast, they don't necessarily listen to the podcast, but they engage with it in other ways because they might watch a video clip. So Stephen Bartlett would be a great example of that I do it all the time. I watch the video clip on LinkedIn or Instagram, I think, sound looks amazing. Yeah. I've got to listen to that, and then I never do, but I still think, wow, it's got a great guest. They're talking about something amazing. I wouldn't get too hung up on the numbers. And also, I can actually send somebody who was it to ask the question?
Rian.
So I'm really happy to send you a blog post, which is from I think it's from Omni, which is one of the platforms that looks at the number of downloads in the kind of putting it into context. Right. And so if you get so many downloads a month or an episode, then you are in the top 10% of podcasts. And also bear in mind that a lot of podcasts don't keep going after 7 episodes. So if if you keep on doing your podcast, you will build an audience. Well, you should build an audience.
I've got my own question to ask here, actually, haven't I? So if someone has made a start, and maybe they've done 2 or 3, all right? Because we've all got probably 2 or 3 in us, haven't we? We can keep momentum going for that long. And then, of course, you start to feel a bit downhearted.
Yeah, because you feel like nobody's listening.
Yeah. What's the point? Blah, blah, blah. And success seems slow. My question is, what advice would you give them?
So I would say when you're starting out, make a plan. And ideally, you want to record in batches because it makes the workflow much easier. So and I generally do this now, I've gone back to mainly in-person recordings, and I will record with a client like 4 episodes in one day. Got 4 one-hour slots booked. So make a plan. Ideally record in batches and also record in series or seasons. So say we're going to start off by doing 8 episodes, then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to do another 8-episode series later on in the year, and have your kind of timings there. Factor in it all into your workflow. So how much time are you going to spend on this? How much budget are you going to put behind it? I would say you want at least half the budget you put behind it to go on marketing it. Yes. Because it is the most disheartening thing when you produce what you think is brilliant content and then nobody's listening because they don't know about it. So discoverability is a really big
key part.
It's a massive challenge in podcasting. And I love all the recommendations because I sometimes can't find, I sometimes spend an hour at night thinking, I've got to find a new podcast. I spend an hour looking and I can't find anything. I listen to 3 trailers and I'm like, well, I've not found anything that I really enjoy listening to. So think about how people are discovering your podcast. To get your podcast listed on Apple's homepage, it needs to comply with all of Apple's rules, which are not very difficult.
Yeah, okay.
But it needs to have original artwork. It needs to it needs to have the text written a certain way. Again, I can send out the list. I mean, it's basically 1 page of rules, but if your podcast doesn't comply with those rules, Apple aren't going to promote it.
No, okay.
So, but it is marketing it and getting it out there to people is one of the biggest challenges. But if you look at all the most successful podcasts, they've nearly all got a massive back catalogue. They've been doing it for years and years. So sometimes it is just a case of keeping at it. And you've got to enjoy it. And if it's a work one, it's got to fit into your workflow. Look for the easy wins with the workflow because, I've spent years looking at how to make it all work a bit more seamlessly. Yes. And there are lots of kind of tips and tricks that I can suggest, but having it working well as part of your workflow and not spending like 2 days a week trying to make and edit your podcast, because you will give up very quickly.
That's fantastic advice. I think, obviously batching it up, doing them together, giving yourself a break and then coming back to do another round. So
and you can review it.
You've got your energy, and you can look back over it. And then actually, I was just thinking about, again, podcasts that I listen to. I've got some that I download them for going on a plane. Perfect for me. And I can re-listen to something that I've listened to 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Because that's it. Once they're there, aren't they? It's not like something live.
Yeah.
Once you've created that content, yes, it might not soar in those first 6 months, but who's to say what it'll do in sort of 24 months?
Yeah, and actually it's quite interesting that with some of the podcasts that I make, that we sometimes get spikes in old episodes. So some people will come to a new episode or come to the podcast via a new episode for the first time and then look at the back catalogue and be like, oh, that's an interesting one. And I do the same thing. I'll kind of scroll through certain conversation podcasts and think, oh, I'm really interested in hearing from that person. And on that note, creating evergreen content is really useful because it can just sit there. Some podcasts like The Rest is Politics, for example, that's going to go out of date very quickly, but something like The Rest is History will be more evergreen because that's in the past.
Yeah, fantastic.
And I was going to say something before I forget.
Yeah, please.
One of the biggest tips that I would give to anyone who is either doing a podcast and struggling to kind of make the work fit into their workflow or looking to start a podcast for their business, if you spend money on one thing, it would be an editor.
Yeah.
So it's the most time-consuming part of podcasting. If it's done badly, it sounds terrible. And so, I'd highly recommend if you're going to spend a bit of money on one thing, it should be outsourcing the editing.
Yes, I mean, and again, we don't make podcasts here at Purple Monster, but we certainly do video, so I know how much time our editors can spend turning some, video content into something as well. So I totally understand how important that skill is and how we need it. I'm going to pause and see if we've got any questions, because we've had half an hour, but we're absolutely fine for another 10 minutes if anyone's got any burning questions for Juliana. I've probably got another couple of questions for her. But guys, if you've got anything that you want to ask, now is the time. Get your fingers busy. Okay, so Juliana, thank you. There's a huge amount of knowledge that you've shared with us there. So it's recorded, so guys, you can listen back to it if you want to, and we can go back over it and we can share it with other people. Is there anything else you'd like to say? I mean, you've just given that great tip about the editing. I think my question for you, just to wrap up, would probably be, I think I was going to ask you at the beginning, actually, why do you think podcasts are so successful and so, they've just become such a great thing that everybody loves? Why do you think that is?
Well, I was thinking about this, and partly because I've got something coming up, but the podcast that started it for me was Serial, which was out 10 years ago, which was like the original crime podcast. Yeah. And the woman who made that, Sarah Koenig, is doing a talk in London in a couple of weeks' time that I'm going to. But I think that the true crime is like a real genre in itself.
It is.
Away from business podcasts. But I think that was a podcast that kind of launched podcasts for a lot of people. It got the idea of a podcast in front of them. They understood how it worked and all the rest of it. I think they've taken off now because I think people want something that's a bit more intimate. So you've got TV. You feel sometimes a bit cheated with TV because you feel like it doesn't quite. It doesn't go very deep.
Yes,
you've got TikTok. You've got so many different things pulling your attention.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think with a podcast, you feel like you're properly engaged with it. So I think there is a lot of, you can listen to a podcast while you're doing something else, like going out for a walk or doing the boring housework at home.
Yeah.
So I think it's an easy medium to engage with, but I also think you feel like you're learning something and you're engaging with something or you're being entertained by something in a way that you don't necessarily do when you're watching TV or doing other things.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I love to read, but I really struggle to find the time. Whereas I walk the dog, I can put a podcast in. I can drive my car and listen to a podcast. And I think, I like audiobooks actually as well, but actually what I find, the podcasts are easier because they're shorter.
Yeah.
And actually, again, if I was reading a book, I tend to like to go back over it and reread, some of the pages. So, and like I say, the thing is, I just don't have the time. Whereas the podcast is instant. It's in my ears. I can do, like you say, I can multitask and take in that moment of intimacy, if you like you say, sort of more, one-to-one almost.
Yeah.
And then, like you say, that element of, right, okay, yeah, that's changed my mindset today, or it's given me something to think about. So, I'm constantly using my brain, which always feels good when you're a middle-aged woman like me.
I think there's something about the niche podcast, the niche audiences. You can start a podcast about absolutely anything and probably find your audience. It might be a very small audience, but you can find your tribe because the barrier to entry is low. It's cheap to start a podcast. Anybody can start one from their bedroom. The sound quality might not be great.
Yeah, we've talked about the mics, yeah.
And also with the business that can spend a bit of money on it, again, the barrier to entry is low. So it's quite a nice way of kind of connecting with an audience, displaying your thought leadership. The more, I say it all the time, but the more niche your podcast is, the better. But it's a fun thing to do.
Yes, yeah. I'm going to close out now. We're going to read some of these comments because they're really lovely. So we're just going to close on some of your comments from the audience today. Anna Bates, thanks for joining, Anna. Anna said, thank you. It's really interesting info. It's a daunting area of building my business. So this has been really useful. So great.
Oh, thank you, Anna.
I'm really pleased about that. Jason said, really good. So many tips and a good platform to use. And thank you, Jason. Thanks for joining. Have a lovely birthday. Sophie said, really handy tips. Thank you. Rian said, thanks so much. Such an interesting space. I had no idea that you would share so much information today, Juliana. So I've learnt loads. I hope everyone else has on the call. One more question. How do I stop sounding so nasal? From Sophie. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. Sorry, Sophie. You mean that in all seriousness? Is that a mic?
I don't. It can be a microphone. It can be a few different things. There's a woman who I know called Nick Redman, and she does lots of stuff on Instagram about voice. She's a voice coach.
Yeah.
So, Sophie, if you get in touch with me, LinkedIn or Instagram, it's Decibel Podcast, or on LinkedIn, it's Anna Needham. I will happily connect you to her because she just shares loads of content. And likewise, anyone else who's got any more specific questions, send them through LinkedIn. I'm more likely to see it through LinkedIn, but really happy to answer any specific questions that you have that will help you get going.
Juliana, thank you so much. That was
Thanks for having me.
Really great. And thank you all for joining. Have a great day. And I'll be here in a couple of weeks' time with another guest. So I'll let you know when that is. All right. Thanks, guys. All the best.